My name is Dr. Zebulon Miletsky. I'm an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at Stony Brook University, right up the road. I'm really happy to be here. I've been invited to do this talk at the Library of Learning and hearing all kinds of stories about the library, particularly about the building and kind of how it came to be in this location. And that's really very interesting to me. I didn't get a chance to say this to anybody so far, but I know there's a software company that used to be here, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of companies that bear the name of Hop On. I believe there was a software company been in this building. I wonder. and so I always think of this as a high tech kind of place, and a place with technology is driving the way. That's the most of what I know about it, and the library certainly bears that out. Um, so I want to thank you for coming. We're gonna just get started. I hope to talk about a number of things. We didn't talk about how long we'll go, but I'm thinking, an hour total, including Q&A. I'm getting a big nod. Okay, so that's good to know. And so why don't we just, get started, get into it. And as we go, and at least as we get to the Q&A portion, certainly be a chance to not only ask questions but also interact, and it would be nice to do that. It's kind of nice being on a Sunday. I think of when I think of Juneteenth, which is coming up next Sunday, right? We're starting that celebration in my mind. It starts today, and whether you know, I think whatever information you already bring to the table about Juneteenth by the end, hopefully everybody will be in a celebratory kind of sense about what Juneteenth is and why it's important, the history, but also just the feeling of it, because it is a holiday after all. It's a national holiday now, as everybody knows. I think that's why people came out. So I'm happy to have a little crowd here. I appreciate you. Um, I'll be happy to share more information as we go, but I don't want to talk just too much about myself, but to get really more into the topic. I hope you can all hear me. And okay, I don't have the microphone. That's we have this microphone for the recording system. Um, with that other microphone, is that one for the speakers, or that's just for the recording too? Okay, okay, I can do louder for sure. Um, so uh, let me start by saying that uh, the facts of the matter when it comes to Juneteenth are that slavery in America was abolished with the 13th Amendment. If we could say that slavery was abolished, we'd say that it was abolished with the 13th Amendment, which was passed by the Senate April 8th, 1864, and the House on ratified, that is January 31st, 1865, and ratified on December 6th, 1865. And I say that why? Because although many say that Juneteenth, and you probably have heard that Juneteenth, one of the attributes, one of the reasons it's being celebrated, is one of the oldest celebrations, so it's claimed, one of the oldest celebrations in the United States of the end of slavery. But it's important to remember that prior to December 1865, which is when the 13th Amendment was adopted and ratified, um, several states in the Northeast and in New England had already emancipated their slaves, beginning with Vermont in 1777, followed by Pennsylvania in 1781, Massachusetts in 1783. Many of these states have enacted an Emancipation Day in which they celebrate their emancipation. Remember that in New England and a little bit later here in New York, slavery is already abolished well before 1865. So these are earlier celebrations of emancipation that have been ongoing. I'm going to get to how that connects to the bigger one of Juneteenth. Many of these states have enacted an Emancipation Day, which they celebrate their emancipation. The state of Texas, obviously, being June 19th. And by the way, Texas has been celebrating Juneteenth since 1980. 1980s when it became a state holiday there. So, so while to a lot of us this Juneteenth thing may come out of the blue, what is this? I never heard about this before. I never heard of it. Um, how did it happen? Uh, it's part of this longer, ongoing tradition of celebrating the end of slavery that goes back to New England and to New Jersey and New York later. Vermont being the first state in America to abolish slavery. Florida celebrates its Emancipation Day on May 20th. Mississippi celebrates Emancipation Day on May 8th. And Washington, D.C. enacted such a law in 2007, which gave its citizens a day to celebrate, being April 16th. Why did they celebrate the end of slavery on April 16th in Washington, D.C.? Because in Washington, D.C., you had something called Compensated Emancipation, where the federal government actually paid slave owners per slave that they owned. In order to have emancipation in Washington, D.C., that's our nation's capital, as I believe everybody knows, they used the tax dollars, your tax dollars, my tax dollars, well, people who came before us, to pay for slaves, to pay the slave owners for what was indeed considered, as we all know, as their property. And so to this day, they celebrate what's called compensated emancipation. And they commemorate the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act, which officially abolished slavery in the nation's capital in 1862. The act, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War, paid D.C. slave owners up to $300 to give their slaves, and ultimately freed more than 3,000 slaves, according to the U.S. Senate website. The act set a precedent for the Emancipation Proclamation that came several months later. So this is a year before the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the only time in history that the federal government paid $1 million in 1862 to free the slave that was part of Lincoln's strategy to win Civil War. So I'm going to get to that history in a moment. I just wanted to share that sort of like beginning part with you to let you know that people have been celebrating the end of slavery for a long time. Indeed, all the way back, depending on what state you were in. If you were in Vermont, they've been celebrating it essentially since Vermont ended slavery in 1777. And I don't know if anybody knows, but in New York, slavery is not abolished until 1827. 1827. But I'm going to get to all that. So let me back for a minute and talk about some of the history that's sort of behind this. And so you might say, well, why are we talking about New England and New York? Juneteenth happened in Texas. How does Texas come into play with this, and how does that connect to the history that we're talking about? And so one of the things that's going on as we talk about the years that lead up to the history of the Civil War, because there's really no disconnecting Juneteenth with the Civil War, right? And I'm going to talk about why that is. And I'll come back a little bit to keep talking about things a little bit closer to home here. It was with the arrival of Union troops in Galveston, Texas, under the command of Mayor General Gordon Granger on June 19, 1865, right, which is after the Civil War has already come to an end, that slavery ended in America, well after the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as passage of the 13th Amendment in January of that year, which was still in the process of being ratified. Dating back to 1865, it was on June 19th that the Union soldiers, led by Gordon Granger, landed at Galveston, not just with news that the war had ended and that the enslaved were now free, but literally to liberate slaves that Texas was still holding in bondage. What that means is that even though the Civil War had already come to an end, they were still holding slaves in Texas. They were doing so in in contravention of the Emancipation Proclamation. So they go literally to liberate the slaves that Texas was still holding bondage in violation of the Emancipation Proclamation. Note that this was 2.5 years after President Lincoln's proclamation, which had become official January 1st, 1863, which is also the same reason that a lot of Black people celebrate emancipation on New Year's Eve. If you know about things called watch nights that happen at a lot of Black churches, the reason being goes back to the Emancipation Proclamation, was passed in January 1st, 1863. So what it all comes down to is a lot of different celebrations of emancipation that have been going on for a long time in various places and for various reasons. And so what leads up to that history? How do we get there? And this is the sort of the part that deals with our history as a country, with American history. See, which is no surprise, between 1830 and 1860, a rising tide of racism and violence met with a growing abolitionist militancy. That means people who were fighting for the abolition of slavery, to bring slavery to an end, along with this concept of manifest destiny, which legitimized war for territorial expansion. Manifest destiny simply means the idea from sea to shining sea, how America spread from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. The idea of white supremacy, which is also part of this, that white people were a superior race. Nativism, which is kind of, if anybody ever saw a movie called Gangs of New York, where you had there were these, the guys who basically saw themselves as, Native Americans is what they called themselves, although they weren't Indians, they were white. They were what we call white, they saw themselves a more Anglo tradition, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And then they saw groups coming from places like Ireland and other places as being like a part of America. So that's nativism. There was a scientific justification that supposedly proved that white people were superior to Black people. Continued enslavement of Black people. This is something that's going to continue happening and had been continuing on. And the extermination of Indians and Native Americans. This map shows the southern slave states in 1860. And so, in order to really talk about this properly, I know it's a lot of stuff, but it's important to go back to this really complicated history leading up all the way from, I say, about 1830 up to 1865. It's kind of like our own times, a little bit messy, a little bit complicated, where things are happening as we see in the newspapers every day that we don't always necessarily understand. There was an insurrection in the White House and so on. And so it's like, wait a minute, what? Like, you pick up the newspaper and you see that and you say, do you just turn the page like, oh, okay, this is a normal day in Washington, D.C., right? Or is there something happening? And so this time is a lot like that. And so these are the slave states in 1860. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas all had slavery. It's not a coincidence that all the states that end up seceding from the United States are all those states that also had slavery. And so this shows you the two sides in the Civil War. You can see the southern states. Actually, this breaks down by actually the election in 1860 is actually what this is. And you can sort of see and start to get a sense of how things break down politically. An election that was very close. The Civil War ended in April of 1865 when Robert E. Lee surrendered the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. April of 1865. And yet we find that there are still people being held in bondage by who? By the Confederacy, by Confederate soldiers, right? That were militarily saying, we're not giving up in Texas, we're still fighting this war. by June 1865. Okay, the Civil War ends in April of 1865. We all learned this in school. Remember this, Appomattox Courthouse, right? And everybody like says, okay, the war's over. Robert E. Lee surrenders to the Confederate Army. Uh, so why is the Confederate Army still controlling Texas by still in June, April, May, June, 3 months? That's all it is. That's what Juneteenth basically is. It's the fact that there was still slavery going on after Emancipation Proclamation, very close to the passage of the 13th Amendment, which had not been finished yet, though. That being, to be honest, had not happened yet. So what you got basically is a rogue state breaking the law, right? They're breaking the law of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. They're still holding people in bondage. Because the reason why it's important to say that is because when most people talk about Juneteenth, you hear the story that they didn't get the word. Has anyone ever heard that? Okay, thank you. Okay, that's always the story. Oh, the word traveled late to Texas. They didn't get it in time. Or they said, the Pony Express guy, was assaulted and, what happened? Kidnapped in the way there. That for various reasons, the word just didn't get there. Now, that's a much nicer story, isn't it, than men who are in uniform for the Confederacy of the United States still trying to hang on to something called slavery, which had been ended at the Appomattox Courthouse, like we all learned in school. And that's what Juneteenth is. Union soldiers under General Granger had to go in and liberate the slaves who were still being held in bondage. He didn't just come and read the Emancipation Proclamation. They come in at bayonet point with their rifles drawn and say, sir, what you're doing is illegal. You have no right to hold these people in bondage anymore. Slavery has ended. My goodness, the Civil War itself has ended. And you guys lost. That's what Juneteenth is. Let me give you some more backup to this. As I was telling you, you had the nativists, and you may have remember this from high school too, the know-nothings. Anybody remember reading something, the Know-Nothing Party? The people who they called themselves the Know-Nothings. And they were like guy in that movie that I was just talking about. Bill, I believe his name is in the movie. The guy who cuts everybody off. The butcher. Bill the Butcher, I think that's what his name was. They saw, not only did they look down on black people, but they didn't consider people that we would consider white today to be white at that time. And what you're looking at in 1866 cartoon commenting on the desegregation of city streetcars in Washington, D.C., the black woman on the right, dignified, looking nice, dressed up, middle class, is depicted as a lady of beauty, refinement, and wealth. On the left, the Irish American woman is stereotyped with ape-like features. Not the sister, okay, excuse me, not the beautiful black woman on the right side, mind you. The Irish American woman, her, is stereotyped with ape-like features and working class attire. A servant or housewife, Mrs. McCaffrey, has been to the market to purchase fresh produce and fish. Her basket also holds 2 bottles of alcohol, frequently associated with Irish Catholics. You know they drink. Listen, my family, people, friends. Oh boy. This is complicated. And I see some we've got different beautiful shades in the room and different diversity of the human family, all, not only me and we all, right here in this room. Understand that life is not always what it seems on the cover. Let me show you another point that I'd like to make. This is just a chart. I like to show charts and things when I can. This is a chart that shows the percentage of Black people in different states. Uh, as you can see over here on the sad, somewhat sad left side are the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York. Moving up compared to Northeast, look at that. And then here is New Jersey right next to it. Look at the number of Black people compared first, before we do anything else. Look at the number of Black people compared to the rest of the Northeast states and New England states, noticing that it's quite higher. And then ask yourself, which was the last state in the Northeast to abolish slavery in the United States? It's New York. Because there's a lot more slaves here. There were, excuse me, a lot more enslaved people here in New York and New Jersey than there are in these other places. Vermont, first one to end slavery. Oh, congratulations, Vermont. How many Black people are there in Vermont to this day, right? Is it even on here? It's not even on here. That's how small it is. New Hampshire, Massachusetts. So what I'm saying, folks, we're trying to say is that in New England, to end slavery, while noble, while important, critically important, was not as big a feat, as we might give credit for. Also, slavery in Northeast is a lot different, especially in the New England parts. You're talking about small farms. You're talking about just a few people. Generally, in other words, they were not the gang system of labor that you see in the South Carolinas and in other parts of the country. Am I making sense in what I'm saying? What's also different, in the Northeast, you have winters, very harsh winters here in New York and in Massachusetts and places like that. Not so in South Carolina and Florida and those places. It's more expensive to clothe people. It's more expensive to give them shelter for the winter. It's more expensive is all I'm trying to say. Okay. So we talked about Texas. It's the arrival in Texas. What is Texas all about? As I mentioned, later attempts to explain this 2.5-year delay in the receipt of this important news have yielded several versions that have been handed down through the years of how Juneteenth happened. Often told as the story of the messenger who was murdered on his way to Texas with the news of freedom. Another is that the news was deliberately withheld by the enslavers to maintain the labor force on the plantations. We had heard this too. And still another is that federal troops actually waited for the slave owners to reap the benefits of one last cotton harvest before going to Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. All of these, my good friends and people, are myths. They're myths. Myths developed over time to hide the fact that Texas had broken the law, was in contravention of the Emancipation Proclamation, indeed in contravention with the needs of humanity itself, because slavery was a sin according to the abolitionists and must have to end at all costs. Plus, you won the Civil War. Does it remind you of any other time? People are denying the law, denying the truth. And so you've probably read in other places that, where people have compared, I don't want to make this about this, but they have compared today some of the things that are going on that were the most divided and stuff like that to this time of the Civil War period. And you could get a sense of what that might be. All of which or neither of these versions could be true. Certainly for some, President Lincoln's authority over the rebellious states was in question. But remember, if you know the history of the Emancipation Proclamation, and we're going to look at it in a second if we have time, but it says basically is that slavery is ended only in the states that are in rebellion to the Union. Where Lincoln could end slavery, he chose not to. There were border states like Tennessee and Maryland that had slavery. And he does not end slavery in the places where he legally can end slavery. He only ends slavery in the places where legally he has no jurisdiction at all, which is essentially, for what is all intents and purposes, another country. Right? Just like the United States would no more pass a law in Canada than Canada would pass a law here. You don't have the jurisdiction. Well, the Confederacy of the Confederate States of America was another country, had its own currency, had its own government, had its own president, had its own vice president. Jefferson Davis, the president, had its own capital in Richmond, Virginia. This is another country. And this is the place where Lincoln ends slavery. Okay, let's keep going. So Texas, and when Texas comes, Texas has a very interesting history in America. Sam Houston, all that stuff, Don't mess with Texas. There's reasons where all that stuff comes from. It comes from their history, which I don't have enough time to really go into all of it. But the Texas annexation, the annexation of Texas to the United States, which ends up being populated by mostly Tennesseans, a lot of people from Tennessee that end up moving. I believe Sam Houston himself, if I'm not mistaken, was from Tennessee. And this is that manifest destiny thing that I had talked about earlier. This from sea to shining sea, like we sing. James K. Polk, the president, wanted Texas and Oregon annexed in 1845. You have a war with Mexico. Remember all this, the Mexican-American War? I know it's a lot of history. There's really no way to explain Juneteenth without some of this history. It's some of the most confusing history in all of American history. So it's hard to explain some of it. But anyway, you know that there was a war. And manifest destiny leads to renewed sectional conflict. Here is that symbol of manifest destiny with America depicted as an angel in white moving west, and you can see the wagon trains and the different people following. The war with Mexico sparked sectional conflict. Let me just put it like simply, anytime America expands and grows, the question on everybody's mind is about what's going to happen in that new land. And what they're thinking about is what? Slavery or not? You can explain almost all of American history that way. As America grows, remember, it was 13 colonies at first. It was only the 13 colonies. And as America continues to add territories to the nation, it grows and it moves. Then you have Ohio into the Union. You have other states come to the Union. And the question that everybody's asking is it going to have slavery or not? Slavery advantage, you don't have to pay. It's free labor, right? You can get your state kind of going pretty fast. I would argue it's no coincidence America is the fastest growing, empire in the history of the world, the fastest growing and richest country in the world before anyone else, because you had a shortcut called slavery. So everybody wants to know, is this going to be slavery or free or not? And this is the thing that kind of, so Texas is a big prize because Texas is, as you know, it's the biggest state geographically. And so here's a picture of victorious U.S. Army occupies Mexico City, ending the war. You have something called the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, provided territory that has an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any of the Republic of Mexico by the United States by virtue of any treaty which may be negotiated between them, and to the use by the executive of the moneys herein appropriated, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. That sounds familiar. That's going to come back later on in the 13th Amendment. It's not just the 13th Amendment, by the way, that had this term. Well, that's not my point right now. We'll get to that later. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory except for crime whereof the party shall be first duly convicted. We have to write to the people that made the documentary 13 and remind them of this. Anyway, the Wilmot Proviso would have stopped slavery there. And opposition to the war itself came mainly from the northern states, saw it as a plot to extend slavery, indeed, which you could argue it might very well sort of have been. And Henry David Thoreau famously refused to pay his taxes because he believed the war was an immoral advancement of slavery. Former President John Quincy Adams described the war as a Southern expedition to find bigger pens to cram with slaves. Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina abstained from voting, correctly foreseeing that the war would aggravate sectional strife. So what am I saying? With the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War, you get this big swath of land that's been added, which was formerly known as Mexico. And that's New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, California. Oh yeah, they had previously belonged. Yes, ma'am. Exactly. Now we're talking. Exactly. Right. Yeah. What do you do when the border crosses you? You know, we're talking about people crossing the border, but these were already Mexican. You already speak Spanish. These families go back generations. Exactly. 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 So this land is in dispute. Texas has always been in dispute. It's one of the reasons it's probably so like kind of the way that it is because they're always sort of fending off this kind of thing. But anyway, let me just show you real quick. This was all Mexico. This was all Oregon. This was Missouri territory. So the basic kind of way in American history is people. I'm just going to tell you the truth. People like when you talk about cowboys and Indians, that's what that really is called settler colonialism, and it's people moving into these lands that had been Native American lands, and 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 then once you got enough settlers there, that is say Europeans. Uh, I mean, it's better to just for us to be honest. Uh, they applied for that to be a state. They send it back to the U.S. To Washington and say we'd like to this territory known as Arkansas Territory, Indian name, Mississippi Territory. All these are Indian, right? Massachusetts is an Indian. All these are Indians. Out here, I don't have to go into. We'd like to make a state out of this. And so again, as that happened, the government was very encouraging of this, of course, because they want the country to grow from sea to shining sea. But this was the problem is Mexico this is all Mexico. How do you get from sea to shining sea? And so through various land deals, starting with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, you have something called the Missouri Compromise. Why is it a compromise? With each new territory, the question became this whole delicate balance between slave states and free states. This issue of slavery is critical. This one problem with American history is that there's like, if you look at a U.S. history textbook, it usually has like maybe a couple pages about slavery in it. Right? But slavery is the key to understanding the whole thing, because with each state has to do with whether it's going to be a free state or a slave state. And these are some other maps. I like showing maps. You can see that we're at map along, with secession. Anyway, I must move on. So I talked about the limit proviso. Then gold is discovered in California. Ooh, that changes everything. Gold. Do you know how valuable gold is? America was interested. Okay, what are we going to do there? Um, and so our system of government, the genius of it is that you have give and take, you have compromise, um, you have a system of checks and balances. And our system of checks and balances is quite ingenious. And so what it results in is a number of compromises that seesaw between slave states and free states. In Ohio, oops, sorry. Oh, this is a touchscreen. Okay, sorry. Ohio, uh, Ohio was admitted in 1803 to the Union, and that gave a total of 9 free slave states. Louisiana is admitted in 1812, keeping the number at, you see how it seesaws back and forth each year? Louisiana has 9. And so America would kind of toggle which states come in that way to keep the number even. That was the goal. Because, how do we say this? I told you about the shortcut that slavery is. With a free labor force, you can basically build something very quickly and with very little investment, actually $0. And so it's a cheat. It's a shortcut. It's un-American because America's about working hard. America's about hard work, right? Well, that's what we're told. Building up things in a noble way. We're a proud country. But when you do it with that kind of cheat, which basically really like destroys so many lives, to put it in like the nicest way I could possibly say it, I mean, destroys lives, destroys bodies, destroys minds, destroys everything. Slavery, I don't have to say this, slavery, it's a problem. It's a problem. But I digress. So you see, 1816 comes in as a free state. Mississippi is admitted the following year as a slave state. Illinois comes in as a free state in 1818, and 1819 Alabama comes in as a slave state. Nobody wanted to upset the very delicate balance between free states and slave states, because what would happen? Civil war. If the slave states become too powerful, and there's not a free state, or if there's too many free states, they're going to have all the power, and we won't have anything. Not only that, hold on, let me go. And here's a longer list where you can see the South needed new slave states to keep the number of senators. Each state received 2 even. So if you have too many slave states, they get more senators, because you know that every state gets 2 senators, no matter what the size is. Even big old Texas and tiny little Rhode Island, the same amount of senators, 2. How many Congress people, though, does Texas get versus Rhode Island? Yes, sir. Based on population. And who is considered part of the population? Enslaved people too? No, they weren't. Enslaved and Indians not taxed, not part of it. It's only white people, pretty much. What about like South Carolina, which is majority black, or Mississippi, which the population is the majority is black, enslaved? How are they going to be counted? America had an idea for that too, the 3/5 compromise. What if we only count the black people as 3/5? Would you go for it then? And they say, yeah, we will. You can count 3 out of 5 black people, which to say black people back then usually meant, I see this children in the room now, enslaved, those who were forced against their will to work. Usually, not always. You have a lot of free black people too, in places like that. Okay, so it doesn't always mean that, but that's who they were talking about. Am I making sense? So you have an imbalance. Let me go back to the states that withdrew. It's the states that I was talking about: South Carolina. This is the wrong map. I'm sorry, I'm getting all excited. South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. They're the ones that secede from the Union because they have an imbalance of power. Okay. And this map shows again the territory that was created as a result. I gotta move a little faster here, of the Mexican-American War. The territory as a result of the Mexican-American War, which had been Mexico, is now Utah territory, New Mexico territory, the Texas annexation. I got to get back to Texas. Although the controversy was temporarily resolved, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend, "But this momentous question wakes me like a fire bell in night, awakens and fills me with terror." This is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, tried to put a line into the Declaration of Independence that talked about slavery. He's a very interesting individual for a lot of different reasons. Then you got people who said, all right, like, what are we going to do? There's no way that we can keep black people in this country. We just can't see it. We cannot foresee what they used to call then a biracial democracy. Not biracial as in mixed, but black and white working together or living together. So they came up with an idea about moving all the black people to some other place. Is the only way to say it. Sending free African Americans in Africa as an alternative to emancipation. So you have different kinds of abolitionists. You have the true abolitionists, and then you got some abolitionists who are the kind of abolitionists whose idea for abolition is just to take all black people out of America and move to some other place. But one of the names on that list is somebody that might surprise you. His name's Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln, before he was president in 1850, can I go to the bathroom, buddy? Yeah, might have to use the bathroom. Can I use the restroom? He needs to use the restroom. She'll find, she'll find him for you. All right. So the abolitionist movement begins to grow in England and the colonies in the 18th century. Public sentiment turned away from slavery and toward the rights of man. It evolves past this idea of just moving black people to some other place and actually abolishing slavery. Here's the show's about abolition timeline. New York is an important part of this history. I want to make that very clear. That this again shows the the years in which slavery is ended. Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, is actually created as a state just so that Missouri could come into the Union as a slave state. And that's the Missouri Compromise, that Maine would become a state. All right. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about some more of the abolitionists, but I think I want to bring it to the end and get to talking about Texas. Thanks for coming. It's probably a little too, okay, my man's like, yeah, I'm good too. All right. Thank the family for me, all right? Okay then. Uh, so the Civil War Battle of Antietam is what gives President Lincoln the victory needed to proclaim the end of slavery on September 22nd, 1862. He announced the Emancipation Proclamation to take place January 1st, 1863, as I mentioned. And again, you can see here the way it's written. Lincoln issued the Emancipation 5 days after the Battle of Antietam. But again, I just want to underscore, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall be then in rebellion against the United States shall be then thenceforth and forever free. Only the states that were in rebellion to the United States. That's a key thing. Texas is one of those states. Some people make the argument, especially these days, they say like, Lincoln was not a great emancipator. He passed, I already said it myself, he at one point favored bringing blacks to some other place. That kind of is a notch in the belt, a nick in the armor, if you will. They say the Emancipation Proclamation freed very few slaves, which is true. But that was the military part of it, and that was the idea of it. That was Lincoln's genius, actually, to do it that way. He was only interested in the states that had slavery because he was trying to bring the war to them. Right? He's trying to end the war. If you tell all the people who are enslaved in those places, you are free, and they throw down their stuff and go and pick up rifles to fight for the Union Army, guess what? You're about to win the Civil War. And that's basically what happened. There would be no ending of the Civil War. There would be no victory in the Union victory. If you know the history of the Civil War, you know that the Union was losing badly in that war. If any, I'm sure you guys are probably all history buffs. Lincoln was losing badly. He's writing to his General McClellan. He's not getting back anything. They lost so many victories. The reason why the Emancipation Proclamation comes in Antietam is because that was like the first victory. They were losing. New York was about to recognize the Confederacy officially. And they do so, actually. They have this resolution they passed in Albany that called it the Empire State of the South or something like that. The cotton that came through the wharves and through the docks in New York City, Wall Street, the reason why there's an African burial ground there. Black people like helped build not only Wall Street itself physically, but like figuratively speaking, what Wall Street represents, which is the economy of the entire world. Right? Wall Street is the economic center of the world, is it not? And right there is buried Black people who helped to build it. There's problems with the 13th Amendment. I referenced this already earlier. It has that clause in it, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, which now people are saying that the thing that we said, okay, that really ends slavery, is actually has a loophole in it that deals with people who are mass incarcerated. Yes, sir. He wasn't even here when I said that. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna clap for you. Somebody, you get it, right? That's why. It's not because he was. You're absolutely right, son. It's not just because of you know all the reasons that people said. This is what I was saying when he was outside. It's because to mobilize them to help to win the war, and it does help to win the war. That means that every white American who values the Union or values the United States should be shaking every black person's hand that they see and thanking them for helping to make this country to stay what it is today, free. Right? The United States of America would have been like half of what it is today. And are we not still fighting this fight now? This is exactly, thank you for helping to make that point. This is exactly what we're talking about. What are we arguing about? Voting rights, 15th Amendment, 40 acres and a mule, reparations. Uh, I had wanted to show so many more things. Jim Crow, the term itself, is from a minstrel song created by a person, T.D. Rice. He was buried in Brooklyn because he's from New York. The term Jim Crow was named by a northerner, a New Yorker. Civil War was a bloody war, saw the greatest American deaths of any American war. The KKK is part of this history too. It's founded right after the Civil War by Nathan Bedford Forrest. My understanding is that there are KKK parts in the north as well, and even not that, not as far away as one might think. Here's a picture of a slave market in New York Harbor. Remember that New York itself had slavery too. So we're all implicated in this thing. Uh, Nobody is really exempt or free from some of the tainting of that history. So let me, if I may, bring things to sort of a conclusion. Um, I had, you know, obviously, as you can see, want to say a lot, squeeze a lot of history into a short amount of time, and it's always a difficult thing to try to do. Uh, but suffice to say that there was slavery in New York. You can see the slave market in New York. This is a slave market in New York Harbor. This is New York. In New York's fertile Hudson Valley, plantation agriculture developed, worked by indentured servants and African slaves. And in fact, New York had the highest percentage of slaves, 11% of the population. We looked at the chart already. The busy port of New York had more working slaves during the colonial period than any city except Charleston, South Carolina. So New York's a great place. We've come very far, but it comes from a legacy of slavery, ended not as long ago as other places. Uh, in the North, it was common for slaves to be house servants, craftsmen, and laborers, often working alongside free labor. I showed you this map. Uh, and ultimately, 1789, or really the end of the American Revolution, would have been the perfect time to end slavery in America. It would have been the best time to end it, not only in the North, but also in the South. But that did not happen. Why? Things like the invention of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, uh, helped to make it even more profitable than it had been. Uh, it was much less profitable in the northern colonies where it was outlawed, but it was very profitable in the southern colonies. References to slavery were removed from the Declaration of Independence. I mentioned that by Jefferson. Everyone else made Jefferson take it out. The Constitution mentions slavery in 3 clauses, um, and it regained strength with the cotton gin. And this is the 1787, as I talked about, the 3/5 compromise that talks, that basically, you know, figured out the problem of how to be represented. Um, Before I close out, I do want to share a little bit more about New York, if that's okay with you. Um, African Americans on Long Island, had their own emancipation celebrations, including the Watch Night I mentioned. Um, on July 4th, 1827, slavery was officially and finally ended in New York State. In honor of this event, many celebrations were held by African Americans. Typical of these were the services held in Albany and the address delivered there on July 5th by the Reverend Nathaniel Paul, pastor of the African Baptist Society in that city. And he goes on to give this rousing, address, uh, talking about the glories of the ending of slavery. Um, and when slavery ended, the enslaved in New York, especially specifically in Long Island, had this holiday that they called Pinkster. It was a Dutch celebration for Pentecost, for which many generations it was celebrated from Albany to Long Island. And it involved parades, masquerades, falling on the first Sunday in June. Interesting. The holiday captured the sense of joy and release at the end of winter and the beginning of summer. Pinkster was especially popular on the west end of the island, and Black New Yorkers were still keeping this holiday in the 1840s. So it was just this big party with food and all kinds of things. Pinkster is for Black Long Islanders specific celebration of slavery that happened way before Juneteenth. For many days before it arrives, African Americans come into the city of New York with their sassafras and single hoe for sale. They would bring things, they would sell them, and actually make money for themselves. They were entrepreneurs. Slaves were given 3 days off for the Pinkster holiday. Long Island bondsmen would gather up items they could sell, such as roots, berries, herbs, birds, fish, clams, and oysters, and bring them to Catherine Market in New York City for a few shillings. By 1815, 7 Black property owners were registered in Bellport, East Hampton, Mastic, Greenport, Eastville, Westbury, Success, Smithville, Jamaica, Newtown, and Weeksville in Brooklyn, Weeksville. Some communities in Queens and Suffolk counties were expansions of pre-existing Native American settlements. The Lake Success, Village of Success, all of that has its own history that's hidden, that's covered up, that it's important for us to know about. And I can, later can share some of the, resources if anybody's interested in that. And of course, it was celebrated in the churches. And to this day, if you attend Black church or know people that go to the Black church, they celebrate Watch Night on New Year's Eve because of the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect January 1st. That's proof that you have earlier celebrations. Now, does it matter that New York and Northeast and New England celebrate a little bit early? No, Juneteenth is head up to that. That's pretty much it. Juneteenth is the celebration and the culmination of all of those celebrations, and brings a unity to all of them, no matter what year they were done or for what reason. Now, again, let me just to say the reason why Juneteenth is important is because it was the last one. It was the most recent one. There was never anybody else that had to be emancipated after the slaves in Galveston, Texas. And it was the arrival, as I said, those troops, uh, led by Gordon Granger, landed at Galveston, Texas, not just with the news that the war had ended and that the enslaved were now free, but literally to liberate slaves that Texas was still holding in bondage. You know what? That's heroic. They went in there and told them, Granger goes and reads the Emancipation Proclamation. And there were all kind of myths about that too, that he read it from some kind of porch or some kind of balcony. He goes in at bayonet point, Union soldiers with their rifles drawn. And that's a different thing than just reading something. When you read it with Union soldiers behind you with their bayonets drawn, it adds a little bit more force to it. Uh, Later attempts, as I said, to explain this had all these different myths. Uh, but uh, uh, it's important to remember. Uh, I mean, also, it was a touching reminder of the president who wrote it, President Abraham Lincoln, as the young man was saying, and why he wrote it. Remember that Abraham Lincoln was already assassinated by this time. He had already been shot by John Wilkes Booth at that theater. And so to go in and liberate Black people with the words of Lincoln at bayonet point is powerful. It's important. And that is why we celebrate Juneteenth. That is why Juneteenth is important. And make no mistake, considering the history that we talked about and the history that we're living through right now, that struggle continues. After slavery, you may have heard of something called the New Jim Crow that people talk about. There's a book about this called the New Jim Crow. And it basically says that when slavery ended, um, that we've simply found a new way to continue slavery. Slavery by another name, enslavement by being imprisoned, or being on a chain gang, or being in a work gang. Black codes are quickly passed, which make everything from loitering to not having a job to all kinds of things a crime all of a sudden. And today, it's still considered, when young men and women are pulled over in could be in Long Island or it could be wherever for driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood, they're being pulled over for the crime of being black. So is it a crime just itself to be black? These are all things that come out of the Juneteenth experience. That's why young people today are in the streets pushing for change. This is why there's a big demand today for abolition. Imagine we're talking about abolition today, not abolition in the 19th century, but abolition now. And that struggle is all gives credit to the people who organized. In Texas, they basically were like, nobody knows our story. Like nobody understands this. They're saying it was because of this, it was because of that. And so generations and generations kept working to create the Juneteenth holiday. On January 1st, 1980, Juneteenth became an official state holiday in New York, in Texas through the efforts of Al Edwards, an African-American state legislator. It celebrates African-American achievement and freedom while encouraging continuous self-development and respect for all cultures. They get together and have, barbecue and stuff like that. And they always did it at the same park. They drink strawberry soda and, talk to one another, exchange ideas. And so I want to thank all of you, for being here. In my mind, it just takes a small group of people, but it's a start. We can do the same kinds of things in places like Long Island and other places that are dealing with issues of race, dealing with issues that are very difficult. And by celebrating the contribution that people made in Texas, we celebrate that same struggle here in New York. So thank you. Oh, any questions? Okay, I tried to leave some time. Not much, sorry.
First one, when you had that slide with the percentage of slaves, or blacks, I think it was, you notice that Virginia was up there, North Carolina was up there, Georgia was up there. Wait, not North, South Carolina. North Carolina was way low. How did that happen?
It has to do with, kind of the history of Carolinas in a sense. Remember that West Virginia becomes its own state after the Civil War. It had just been part of Virginia. Carolinas was a similar thing. In South Carolina, it was patterned after Barbados, the island of Barbados, the exact same colonial plan, to make this a place where they just basically we're a slave, a society with slaves. This is a slave society. This is a society with slaves.
Come down to when they did that draft.
Exactly. So South Carolina was built and set up. The idea always being that the minority of people would be white in control of this large black population, patterned after the Caribbean.
The second thing that comes to mind is you were going over how they admitted the states to keep political power equal.
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't you think that we've sort of gone full circle in recent politics?
Well,
I mean,
I was tempted
it's
to, but that's not my job. I came here to talk about, to bring the history,
yeah,
and so I didn't want to go on about that.
but
But
it seems like it's come full circle in that respect.
yeah, I would tend to agree with you, sir. I would agree, and I think that that's why conversations like this, and I really thank you to the library, give them a round of applause too, to
The
her in particular.
final point I want to mention is my wife, she visited the Alamo. We all grew up learning about the Alamo and how all those Kentuckians and Tennesseans went to.
Yes,
It was a mission, but my wife went there and she's got a different uh, view on it from her tour. She wants to explain.
I'd love to hear it.
I don't know too much. I'm Trinidadian.
Ah,
I'm from Trinidad.
it's
And
better for the recording, if you don't mind.
I'm from the island of Trinidad. I don't know anything about US history. We hardly know anything about our own history. I only got involved in it and started to learn some stuff when I realized that in the War of 1812, that England, when we're losing the war, came to the slaves here in the US and asked them to fight for them
Yeah,
and promised them that they would free them after they fought. And they still lost.
because we were colony too.
Right. They still lost, but then the slaves were like, what now?
Mm,
So then they started depositing all these slaves in all these islands, Canada and everywhere
yes,
like that.
yes, yes.
And Trinidad was one of the places that they went to. And recently, when we went to visit my family in Trinidad, we went to the one town called Moruga, where all these the slaves settled there, and they got land, got free land from the English. And it's still that way today. The land is still free. They could never sell it. They could only pass it on to family members. And so I got interested in it that way. So I always hear about the Alamo. I didn't grow up here. I didn't go to school here. I don't know anything about the history. I went to the Alamo. I I travel for work.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm a flight attendant. So
Okay.
every time I touch down somewhere, I try to go see something historical.
Beautiful.
So I went to the Alamo and I asked the young man who was there, the curator for the Alamo, because I walked in. To me, it looks like a big empty space. I don't see anything. It's like a church. I'm just like, what's going on here? But anyway, so I look up on the wall and there's a big hole in wall on the top, so high up on the wall. It's very dark, but it looks like a person could bend down and walk through it, but it's so dark, so it's not a window. So I just asked him, what is that? And I don't see any information written of what that is. That's very odd. There's no stairs leading to it. There's no way it could be open.
You had the nerve of using your own mind and intelligence to ask a question at the Alamo. That's what I'm getting out of this so far.
So then he explained to me that that is a room back there, up there so high in the dark, where when they brought the Dutch and everybody else, when they were during that whole fight, that whole thing was about this whole slavery thing also.
There you go.
They brought in slaves and they stored them in there, in that holes there, like boxes. Some of them wouldn't survive because they would suffocate. There was no light, and they were just stacked them on top of each other in there. And then so obviously my next question was, well, why isn't that information here?
And I've never been to the Alamo. I'd like to go if I ever get there. I'll check for that. But I think your eye found something that is covered up literally, but also in our history in America, especially. We don't talk about slavery. It's in a hole somewhere else. That didn't happen here. The Alamo is about Sam Houston. The Alamo is about all of these other things. Davy Crockett and the hat and the rifles, and it tells a beautiful story, one that is very easy to identify with, about patriotism and so on. Covered up as the fact that, as you pointed out, was all Mexico, right? We know, and this movie that I'm sure someone in here is going to remember, called Giant. From the 1950s. It's a great movie. I think everybody knows more or less about Giant. But think back to that movie and Little Rieta and all that. It told the story that was a lot of truths in there. The movie was kind of controversial, considered controversial at the time, because it said a lot of things that were truisms. And so when you march into a place and not only take the land from the native people that are living there, because that's the case in Nebraska and Iowa and all of the Midwest, but then also fight a war against the country that once possessed it. An eternal outpost where you're looking out the window and fighting off anybody who's coming and holding on to what's yours or what you have taken, I should say. And so that's how. And so, what does that mean? That also means, and I think I forgot to say this, but it should be obvious to us that when Texas was Mexico, there was no slavery there.
No, I have a question about that.
Texas, so Texas is different from all these other places because Texas starts slavery much later and for a much shorter amount of time. So when the Civil War comes, they're like, we only had it for like 35 years. We were just getting started with this. And they want to hold on to it. And that's where the union has to come back and say, hold on a second. Civil War is over. You lost. And today, as you know, a part of our current woes is the lamenting of the lost cause. That's what the Confederate flag's all about and all that stuff. You know, sorry, go on.
So okay, so all those border states that was Mexico. What happened when they bought it to the Mexicans that were already living there?
Right. I understand they didn't get too
What's
much.
the history of that?
It's not great.
Is it true though? Because I read somewhere that it was agreed upon that the people that were already living on that side, which would be the U.S. side now,
yes,
I think they bought it or something.
Yes,
would be Americans. But then when they wrote up the paper, what official papers, whatever it is, they wrote up the document. They were promised by mouth that those Mexicans would become Americans.
Yeah.
But when they wrote the document, they left it out on purpose.
That's a great question. My understanding is that those haciendas, those large tracts of land that they owned and stuff like that, that little by little, they're going to find themselves, sort of on the unequal side of things, which shouldn't be a shocker, and so I believe you're right. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that. I think they had a choice about keeping one citizenship or another. But a lot of people left. A lot of people lost those. Little by little, are going to lose the sense of the old Spanish land titles that they owned. They weren't honored, basically, is my understanding. Yeah, and Trinidad, of course, has that Spanish influence. Trinidad, which is a Spanish word, and Tobago, and Latin Quarter, and so on. It's a mix, and we got that in the U.S. too. Louisiana is a good example of that. It was in Spanish hands and it was in French hands before it became American. And if you go to Louisiana, I'm sure probably fly there. I'm not sure what airline
we went on vacation.
Of course.
We went on vacation.
I'm thinking JetBlue. What do we got here? American. Yeah. And so you got parts of the United States. So like, I'm from Boston originally. Boston is as close to the Mayflower, literally, you could get, because the Plymouth Rock and all that stuff's nearby. They didn't have anything to do with some of us Bostonians, but other parts of the country that become part of America are done so through territorial expansion and that whole process that I was talking about of from the coast, from sea to shining sea, manifest destiny. It's a nice idea, and you see the angel was depicted, but for people that lived in those places, it was a bloody affair, colonial affair, and one of settler colonialism. And America has rules, laws. A lot of there are laws on the books. If you know the system and learn the system, people have been able to get some kind of remuneration historically for land and things that we take. You can't bring someone's life back and forth. If a chief was massacred and he was a grandfather, like a whole bunch of people, like he's gone. But U.S. We fix things through legal stuff.
We visit every so often, Tim and I, a day off of school and go to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. If you go there, you learn a lot.
Oh, yes.
A lot. But be
Wonderful.
prepared to be in there all day.
I've been, that I have seen, that I have gone, and I want to go back. It was, she's absolutely right. And I'll get your funny names later, but she is absolutely right. And it's everybody should go there because it's eye opener. And there's an African American. There are museums. There are not African American museums out here. I don't think. I think there are some though. The Eastville Center.
Close, but I've been there. Yeah.
Ah, okay. I haven't
There's
seen
something on Long Island here.
That's great.
I forgot the name of it, but it's not too far from me.
Yeah, yeah. Did anyone else have a question?
Somewhere around.
You want to
But I am interested in the rights of people, and I just see a lot of like, I don't know if this is just the way America is, but with that the Alamo thing that you were saying, it just seems like people don't want to confront anything unless it's pleasant. And they'll go, "This is the Alamo, you know, it looks beautiful," but like, what is it really about?
Right.
And I work in a school, and they recently put me working with the DEI committee because I see things and I hear things. I'm a music teacher, and I listen to everybody talking, and I hear things, and I'm like, you know, when we started doing LGBTQIA rights, and I'm the music teacher, I heard things like, "You're the music teacher. Why are you talking about like?" Yeah, and I'm just like, everything has to be pleasant and beautiful. You know, history, as long as it's happy history.
Right.
Just like what?
All I can say is keep going.
Yeah.
Don't stop. You may feel weird. I feel weird. You know, coming up, a little baby started crying. I was like, "Oh my gosh, what we're gonna do now?" But you know, it's weird. It is awkward. But people of good conscience and people of good faith keep doing what they're doing.
I'm not gonna stop.
Yes, work in your area where you are. That's what I'm doing, and it's just a beautiful place, Long Island. There's enough for everybody here. There's so much resources and so much wisdom and intelligence and everything. And you know what's happened in the past has already happened. Unless you can build a time machine, we're not going to be able to fix any of those things. But we have to fix them. Like you see in the news, they mentioned Long Island's the most segregated place in America. Is what this. I could be crazy, but I believe I read that in Newsday. And also that the school system is the most segregated in the country, they say. Here, not some other place, not even Boston, where I'm from, which didn't have a good time with this at all. I wrote a whole book about it. Comes out in December. Anybody's interested? But because I'm here in New York, though, and my dad's from here, and my grandfather too, on my mother's side, my African American side, and my Jewish side. But my Jewish side is where my dad's from. I grew up in Long Island. He grew up in Brooklyn and Long Island. Because I'm here, I have forced myself to try to learn this history in New York and in Long Island, and find out about places, Hauppauge and other places that I don't know about that well. You know, I'm not. They lived in Belmont, which is like practically Queens, you know. So we're barely in Long Island to begin with. And so life has a funny way of doing things. I ended up teaching at Stony Brook University. You know, and to have the privilege to talk with folks like yourselves, to take a time on a Sunday afternoon and to come out and hear me, I really appreciate it. And I hope you got something out of it. And I hope you'll stay in touch. And I don't know if I always forget to put cards and out there. But you can find me at Stony Brook. You just look me up on there. There's no other person named Zebulon Miletsky. I promise you, probably all of the United States. So you should okay. But let's keep going. And you know, if we don't figure out these things, you can see where things are going if we don't. So a lot of people say, well, someone else will do it, or I'm just a regular person. What could I do? Trust me, if you've had that conversation with yourself, it's you. And the fact that you're here, it's you and me, her, and all of us. So keep on keeping on. Thank you.